Today on Geeks of the Movies, we're reviewing The Witch, a New England folktale, a story of a 1630s family torn apart by black magic, witchcraft, and possession. Hola, Geek fans! Welcome back. It's time for another in-depth review of Geeks of the Movies. This is where we bring you a bit of film criticism and a history lesson all rolled into one. I'll be your host today. I'm Shane Gerich, and joining me, as always, our illustrious lead writer of Geeks of the Movies, Richard McLeod.
Hey, folks.
Now, today, we're going to warn you we're doing something a little different. We've been on a hiatus of sort, so we thought we'd ease ourselves back into it by doing something a little different. Normally, we focus on historical dramas here. We focus on movies set in the past, set in a period before modern times, but attempting to be grounded. Now, they sometimes succeed and they sometimes don't, but that they're a grounded film based in reality. Now, we're going to give one spoiler for The Witch, that there is a witch. So immediately you're thinking, why are you doing an historical review of The Witch when it has fantasy elements, when there's a witch? It's a horror film. And the reason we're doing this is because the attention to detail the director gave, directed by Robert Eggers, he went out of his way to recreate New England life in the 1630s just to make you believe in the story more. And I was really engrossed by this film. I don't usually watch horror films. Why don't you tell the audience, Rachel, a little bit about the plot?
Okay, so basically what we have here is a family in the early colonial New England, 1630s family, and for whatever reason, their religious differences have set them apart from their plantation, and they're sent into banishment.
Right.
And from the get-go, they basically established their own little family homestead in the middle of nowhere, in total isolation from like anything else in the planet, as far as we know. Basically, I'm exaggerating, but the isolation. And the isolation, added with desperation, brings home the sense of what it was really like to be a colonist in the 1630s.
Yes.
That was the impression I got. Isolation, desperation. And with that, it's just intense.
You're right. I actually didn't think about that point because ignoring any supernatural elements, a lot of people during the colonial period would be living on the frontier. Now, you may go, Massachusetts, the frontier, but it was the frontier in the 1630s. If you're going a little bit away from Plymouth Plantation and the other colonists, you're off on your own. And there's all kinds of potential boogeyman. I mean, the Indians being an obvious example. Right. But then things like witchcraft and whatnot would have put fear into these people's minds. So we're not going to spoil the ending.
No.
Which is a little different than what we usually do. But it is a really interesting psychological picture of people living out in isolation. They have these extreme religious Calvinist views. This idea of predestination, like God's already chosen who is going to go to heaven. He's already done it. You don't have much choice. It's not about works. It's about God choosing, and they tie in this religious fanaticism along with this witch, and it really brings to life a very interesting film that could be difficult for people that are interested in history and also people that are interested in horror. The blending I found fascinating, but I think maybe for some people, one element or another might have turned them off. But I thought it was an interesting combination. Give me some thoughts about the film.
Well, I think what really defined the film for me is the three things: isolation, desperation, and superstition. And when we look at the movie, before we even get to authenticity and historical accuracy of it, the mood of this movie was really locked into the isolation and desperation. And keep in mind, they didn't have like regular cross-Atlantic, transatlantic transit and commerce. You're out there on your own.
They've been banished.
And they've been banished. So if they had any kind of medical issues, if they had kind of health issues, if they had kind of hysteria, any kind of disasters, they're on their own. And also keep in mind that because they're on their own, their building materials, they're living off the land, the building materials are in the woods. Everything they needed was basically what they had immediately around them.
It's self-sufficiency. They brought some stuff with them from when they lived in the colony, but they have to chop down the trees. They have to do everything themselves. They have to know how to make the butter and do all those basic things to do to survive.
And with that, with a plot now, they bring their own superstitions. And the superstitions they bring with them are Western European, Old English superstitions mirrored with a lot of the religious oppression that they're escaping from, hence why they're even colonists.
Right.
So there's all that kind of wonderful mixture of tension and isolation and desperation building into this plot, building into this atmosphere, which leads me into discussing our first point is, does this movie show us authenticity? Does it show us the flavorings of 1630s colonization? And I think definitely in spades. If you look at how the film is dressed, we look at the cottages, the clothing, the costuming, it's just wonderful.
It's fantastic. One thing I noticed right away, right in one of the very first shots of the film, they're in the church or the meeting house, and they're having this, I guess, a court proceeding where the leaders of the colony are saying, "Hey, you gotta get in line. I don't know what these crazy religious views you have. If you don't shape up, we're gonna ship you out." And the father is defiant. Played by Ralph Ennis' son, William, he's defiant. He's like, "No, we came here for a reason. I have these views. My views are correct. You're living in blasphemy or whatever." But the shot, they show this wide shot where they show first the women and they show the men. And this is traditionally how they were seated in these meeting houses. The women would be on one side,
yep,
and the men would be on another. And right away I was impressed with that. And partially one of the reasons I was impressed with that is because I saw another film about colonial life. I didn't watch the whole thing. I don't even remember. It was something from the BBC. And it bothered me right away. They showed about the meeting house, and the men and women were mixed, and many of the men and many of the women didn't have their heads covered.
Right.
Here, everyone has their heads covered. They're all wearing hats of sorts or a bonnet. It's just these little small details seem trivial, but they bring to life how the reality was at the time. And I'm like, wow, I can't believe you even bothered with that.
And the impression I got in that meeting house, that council meeting is, are we meeting Quakers? Are we meeting Puritans? But even still, William's take on religion went far and above and exceeded the puritanical conservatism to the point where we just can't tolerate you. Banishment. And when they mean banishment, that means you're out on your own, self-sufficient, isolated. And it's that isolation and the desperation of being a colonist on your own that feeds into this fear and the tension that builds up. This is why I think it was more of a folktale horror movie than maybe traditional, because the horror is they brought so much of their own superstitions with it.
Yes.
They brought their own isolation. They have the desperation. So anyway,
and the desperation and this is slow build. And so once they get out of the colony, once they get outside the wooden palisaded barriers and they go off into the woods to found their own homestead, we see the backdrop of this slow tension buildup with them doing mundane things.
Right.
They're harvesting corn. They're fixing the fence.
Right.
They're milking the goat. They're doing all these various activities that, of course, would have been essential to a farmer living on the frontier. And they get little details right. For example, this film is shot in natural light.
Yeah.
This is very rare. There's not a lot of films shot in natural light, or even have significant portions shot in natural light. And it's one of the major things that ruins historical films is they use artificial lighting. The kind of lighting we have in the studio right now, it's not real lighting. It's not sunlight. There's an ambience and a difference to it. So when you see it in the natural lighting, it really enforces like, wow, it really feels like they're living on the frontier. When you see them in the clothing they're wearing, it's like, yeah, that's what they wore. It hasn't been Hollywoodized or made to look real cool. I hate when they do that. And then to the big thing. This is the thing that probably is really going to turn off a lot of people, but I loved, was the dialogue.
Yeah, the dialogue sets this movie apart.
Yes.
It speaks like King James Bible.
And language reconstruction, first off, is difficult. Trying to understand how people in the past spoke is hard. There's been some other movies that have done this. The New World did it well. So it's a lot of work. They used manuscripts at the time, letters, court proceedings, records of speeches. They use these sources to construct a dialogue. So a lot of the dialogue actually is kind of weirdly pieced together. So it's like, okay, that's an actual sentence that someone said. That's an actual sentence. That sentence makes sense in front of this sentence, and then we'll add some slight alterations for the context of the scene. It must have been a rather laborious process, I'm guessing, but it makes it so enriching, but it will turn off some people. Some people are like, this is Shakespeare, I don't know what they're saying. I would recommend watching with subtitles if you have difficulty. I often watch movies with subtitles regardless. Yeah. I just like doing that. But I think it really brings it to life. Now, I don't know so much about this, but I want to talk about some of the witchcraft stuff, some of that folklore. Rachel, you're a little more interested in this.
Yeah, so when I was watching this for the folklore, I knew it right away that the basis of the folklore, the witchcraft that's being portrayed in this movie, is coming from Western European folklore. Which is very different from, say, the narratives that you might find with the Salem witch trials, which happened much, much later, like about 50-odd years later. Now, the difference between, say, the Salem witch trial folklore and the folklore we see in this movie is, well, with the Salem witch trial, we had the narratives from Tituba, which we remember is the African-American slave that was from Haiti and the Caribbean. So this bringing in African influences, Caribbean influences, voodoo influences from Haiti, which we do not see here in New England because there is no narrative coming from Africa or from the Caribbean. This is homegrown Western European, Celtic, Gaelic, Old English folklore. So you're not going to see any, references to like zombies or to spirit possessions in the same light as, say, the Caribbean folklore. And that's one of the things that I found fascinating. That thankfully they didn't like try to insert something from a different culture. So they stuck to the guns with Western European influences, Western European superstitions, the symbolisms. There's lots of symbolism in this movie. There's lots of things that happen as these folks go through their day-to-day lives.
Yes.
We're going to see some interesting visitations, and I'm not going to spoil it, but interesting visitations. And those visitations draw from Western European folklore.
And they also draw from historical accounts. And what I mean by historical accounts is, of course, in the past, in history, we can get people that said, I saw a ghost, I saw a witch, I saw a person doing X, Y, or Z magic. So we have these accounts of what witches could do, how they did them, what witches did do. Again, we understand these people were either lying, they saw something else, they were under the influence of some sort of drugs. Who knows what happened?
Right.
But they use those accounts to inform the portrayal of the witch. Which I'm not going to get into the portrayal of the witch.
Right.
But when you see the witch doing witch stuff, it's based on folklore. It's based on these historical accounts, these trial accounts. So it adds another level of authenticity where you think to yourself, well, you know what? If they actually did have witches back then in New England, well, this is what it would have been like.
Right, and they kept the continuity of the 1630s. They kept it into the time period. They kept to the origins of where these people came from without inserting, say, the African narrative, because there were no Africans in this particular plantation or within this colony or this little homestead.
But at this point there have been very well in the homestead there was none. At this point in the colony, I'm not sure how many. There've been very few.
Right.
Before we get to our review, I just want to point out a few things. Yes, this movie is ignoring the supernatural stuff. It is not completely historically accurate. There are some minor things that they had to do, a lot of them just for functional reasons or because of budgetary reasons. So here's a couple minor things they changed. So the windows on the homestead, on their house they build, the actual frames, they're larger than they traditionally would have been, and here's why they were: for natural light. Right. The director was like, we wanted to make them with the traditional size. We had to increase them. I think he said by 30%. And then there's another scene in the film where it's at night and they're eating supper, and there must be 3 or 4 candles being used. A poor family like that, they're going to use one candle. Yeah. One candle. They're not, but again, what's the reason? It's hard to shoot with natural light.
And that's just logistical. These are just logistical things. And even still, it's still candlelight, and it's still, the window glass, and they're not reinventing the wheel to make.
Right, they only have so much budget. And another minor point that, there's another, these are all very minor, but another thing the director thought afterwards was like, some of the clothing at times, he's like, I think I should have made some of the clothes slightly dirtier. Sometimes he's like, they're a little too clean, and when they're out and about doing their activities. Again, these are so minor though.
Right, and I think it's for contrast and for visibility and for the visuals. You have to see these people stand out and pop at the screen, and they do pop.
So these are minor things. Overall, I thought this movie was fantastic. I should note, I am not a fan of horror films. So if you're a fan of horror films, I don't know what you're going to think. You have more interest in horror films. So I'm going to give my score, but it's based. My interest was based on the history aspect. That's what I got out of the movie, and I'm giving this 5 stars. I really loved it. 5 out of 5. Yeah. Rachel?
As a horror movie, I'm really impressed. This is a very different horror movie, and I'm not going to spoil anything. I really want you to see this movie.
Watch the film.
I give you a 5 stars for 5 stars for horror.
Whoa.
For the history and for authenticity, this one blew me out of my way. I give it 6 stars.
6 out of 5.
Because really, it's the dialogue that sets it apart from everything else.
I love the dialogue.
The natural lighting. You really feel like you're a witness to what's happening.
Yes.
As opposed to being on the outside, kind of with a bit of a distance. You're really engrossed in this movie, and I thought it really kind of scared me a little bit because a lot of things I expected to happen didn't happen. Do watch this movie, be surprised, and give some feedback. What do you guys think?
Yeah, write in the comments below. Let us know. Regardless, stay tuned for more in-depth reviews of Geeks the Movies. We're going to start up again. And remember, it's always a little bit of film criticism and a history lesson all rolled into one.